Chapter 20. They drove slowly toward the warehouse, which was surrounded by a high chain-linked fence. The eerie quietness enveloping the place was indeed ominous. "Maybe we should drive to the back," Daniel suggested. Gustavo threw him a puzzled glance before penetrating the enclosure through the ripped fence until they reached the corner of the yard facing the warehouse and the back entrance. In the dark, they could see that the yard was littered with the debris of all sorts. When Gustavo switched the engine off, he turned to look at Daniel. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked the young man. "Let's just do it," Daniel replied firmly. At these words, the two of them got out of the car and strode toward the building. Hiding in the shadows, Damianos was watching them. Daniel ran up and looked around him. He and Gustavo cautiously walked over the collapsed gate and crossed the courtyard to get to the open doors at the back of the warehouse. All of a sudden, Daniel stumbled over something. "What the?" he muttered under his breath. The two of them stopped to look at what had obscured their path. They could only see the man's eyes staring at the starlit sky. His chest was covered with clotted blood. Daniel turned away, retching and about to vomit at the sight, and smothered the corpse. "Come on," Gustavo said, patting Daniel on the back. "We've got to get on with it, okay?" Daniel nodded and straightened up without a word. As they continued walking, they could see the shapes of men littering the courtyard, apparently unaffected by the sight of these human remains. Gustavo began running toward the open doors, Daniel in tow. They slammed their backs against the wall, looked around, and slipped through the entrance, one after the other. The place had been plunged in darkness with only moon rays slipping through the cracks of the crumbling walls and corrugated iron roof. It was strangely silent. Daniel turned his head to Gustavo and whispered, "What do we do now?" Gustavo didn't answer, yet Daniel heard a voice in his mind saying, "Just do as you're told, Daniel. Everything will be fine." "Damianos?" Daniel said in a hushed voice, laced with surprise. "Don't talk, Daniel," Gustavo told him. "Just listen for any sound that—" His comments were abruptly cut short by a volley of gunshots outside the warehouse. Inside, they heard people move and rifles being loaded. "You go that way," Gustavo ordered, "and keep your back to the wall." "Where are you going?" Daniel demanded, his voice quivering with anxiety. "To the other side," Gustavo replied, already rushing in the opposite direction. Finding the wall behind him, Daniel slammed his back against it and was about to edge his way toward the corner when a hand grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and dragged him into a small storage room. Adjusting to the dimness, Daniel counted at least 10 American soldiers assembled in that room. They were all armed to the hilt. On one of the storage racks lining the walls, only a few machine guns were left unattended. Without a word, the man who had grabbed him pointed to one of the weapons, nodding. Daniel looked at it, an Uzi. The man took it off the shelf, handed it to him, together with a box of ammunition, saying, "Load it, quickly." Daniel shrugged for a minute until he realized the man had handed him the wrong ammunition. He looked around him, not really knowing what would happen after he loaded his weapon. Apparently ready to exit the room, one of the men nodded and rushed out, followed by his companions. A minute later, Daniel, left alone in the storage room, heard shots being fired. The shooting had resumed. Silently, he wondered where Gustavo was. Undeterred in his purpose, he grabbed a couple of boxes of ammunition off the shelf and knelt down, his breath audible. He tried to fit each of the ammo, which he had found scattered along the shelves, inside the weapons chamber with hands trembling. To no avail. "Try these," Damianos murmured from over his shoulder, handing him another box of ammo. Daniel smiled up at him, took the box and loaded the Uzi. A minute or so later, he joined the other men at the door of the warehouse. There were at least 20 men that had taken cover behind large wooden boxes and other objects placed in front of the open doors. Daniel positioned himself beside the wall next to the door. He pressed his back against it and carefully poked his head around the corner. As soon as he saw light flashes coming from the left of the courtyard, he began firing his Uzi in that direction. At the first few shots, the strong kickback at the weapon threw him off balance. Gustavo then jumped next to Daniel and pushed himself against him in order to stay under the cover of the wall. He shouted, "They are on the tall building on the left, but not for long." They endured fire for a few more minutes until silence seemed to permeate the whole warehouse abruptly. Curious to see what happened, another man moved slowly in front of the open door and aimed his weapon at something. Daniel followed him, his Uzi aimed at the invisible target. Without warning, a shot blasted the silence and blood sprayed everything and everyone behind the man. He had been hit. His body fell at Daniel's feet. Horror-stricken, he fell to his knees and folded his arms over his head. When he raised his gaze and looked around him, all he could see were pieces of skin, bones glued to the doorframe or hanging from the grates behind him. The man's face, his eyes, nose and teeth were littering the ground. All of a sudden, a gust of wind pushed a veil of fog in front of Daniel's eyes. He cried out, "Please, God, stop! Stop, please!" "It's all right, son," he heard Gustavo say as he came to stand beside him. He helped him to his feet and peered into his eyes. "You'll be okay now. Just remember, war is not a game. Death is the only reward you can expect from warfare, whether in the battlefield or later when your memories will not let you rest. Tears coursing down his cheeks, Daniel bent down and placed his hands on his knees. I just want to find Dad and go home, he hiccuped between sobs. And that's what we'll do, Daniel, Damiano said, having joined the two men. He turned to Gustavo. Thank you. Perhaps one day you and Daniel will meet again, but for now I'll take him back. And with these words, Damiano snapped his fingers to transport them back to their boat. If 1979 had been a year fraught with troublesome moments and indelible images of war for Gustavo, so had it been for Dan, and while Gustavo had gone to relive the warehouse incident with his son, a young man he didn't know, Dan had gone back to the depth of his memories while unable to sleep that night. 1979 was the year he had arrived in Florida, having left home behind in Venezuela. He first finished high school and went to college to get his Bachelor of Science. All was going well until a reversal of fortune hit his father, and the loss he sustained drove Dan to having to fend for himself. He had to get a job and start his life with the promise that what had happened to his dad would never happen to him. In the past 9 years, Dan had managed to raise himself out of the proverbial gutter and, after getting his engineering degree, was now well on his way to becoming a fighter pilot. The thought put a smile on his lips in the early hours of the morning when he heard the door of his room open just a crack and Gustavo poking his head inside. You awake? He asked. Yeah, couldn't sleep, Dan replied, kicking the covers aside and getting to his feet. How did it go? How is he? He rushed to ask. Gustavo opened the door wide. He's as stubborn as you are, man, he replied, a broad smiling coming across his lips. Come on, Dan said, walking out of the room. I'll put some coffee on. Let me get that pack off my back and I'll be right with you. He looked down at his hands and blood-splattered clothes. I think I'd better take a shower too. As the two of them were sitting at the kitchen table sipping on a cup of freshly brewed coffee, the silence between them was only broken by Dan asking again, How is he? He's a fine young buck, Dan. He drank some more. You know what amazed me the most about him was his lack of fear. He was disgusted at the sight of a few dead men, yes, but when it was time to face gunfire, he didn't hesitate. He planted himself square across the enemy and began firing his Uzi. Dan was agape. And you let him? He could have been killed. No, Dan, he couldn't have. Remember, you can't change the past, and he only took my place, and when the moment came, the guy in front of him got his head blown off and his body splattered at Daniel's feet. Oh, God, Dan shouted. He's too young to have seen that, Gustavo. How could Nicholas let that happen? No one decided of this happening the way it did, Dan. Only God wanted your son to experience the horrors of war firsthand, and his decision was final, not to be questioned. Dan riveted his gaze on his friend, still having difficulties accepting what had occurred that night. He wondered how Daniel was going to survive the impact of such a horrific display. How did he react? He asked finally. He cried his eyes out, which was a good thing by my way of thinking. Why do you think that? Because he didn't keep the hurt bottled up, like most of us did at the time. He still knew how to cry, unlike us. See, we were all numbed by war. We couldn't cry anymore, and that's why many of us got to drinking when we got home. We couldn't face our memories, and as for me, I tell you, having to relive the incident is the best thing that happened to me since I came home. I wonder what he's feeling right now, Dan said musingly. When they returned to the boat, no one was asleep. Malou got up from the chair on which she had been sitting for most of the night when she heard footsteps on the deck. How did it go? She asked in a rush, hugging Dan tightly as he came down the stairs. I've never been so frightened in my life. Stefano and Gabby were up and out of their chairs like a shot. How was it? What did you do? Gabby shouted. Did you handle any rifle? Stefano asked in turn. It was okay, Mum, Daniel replied, pushing his mother away gently. Let me get out of these clothes, he then said, looking down at his army fatigue, and then threw a stern glance to his siblings. Sorry to have kept everybody awake. Will you just tell us what happened? Stefano insisted, regaining his seat. Yes, Daniel, please, Malou pleaded. It's not something I want to go through again, I can tell you, Daniel replied, sitting himself down beside Gabby. I had seen something like it on the screen of my Xbox, but this was as real as it could be. It was like an ambush. We're all kept at bay in this warehouse. There were about 20 of us in there, trying to get out. Outside, there were these Iranians firing at anyone trying to get out. What happened next? Did you finally get out? Stefano asked. I don't know for sure, Daniel replied, returning his brother's questioning gaze. When I fired my Uzi. You fired an Uzi? Yes, and when I first handled it, I practically fell backward on my butt. That thing has got such a recoil, you wouldn't believe it. And what did you do? Milou asked. Well, we were about to have these Iranians licked when the guy in front of me got hit. Daniel stopped, the words were unable to escape his mouth. What? Daniel, what happened? Gabby asked. Daniel looked around the table, tears at the rim of his eyes menacing to fall. He was killed right in front of my eyes, that's all. You mean the man died instead of you? Milou asked, visibly horrified at the thought. Yes, Mum, he gave his life so we could all get out of there safe. Oh, God, Milou cried out. Why did you have to go and see that? Because, Mum, I didn't know what I was playing at when I was playing with my Xbox. I thought that all I was seeing on the screen was just fun and games, and I thought nothing of it could ever happen in reality, but it did, and it does, Mum. And now believe me, even if I play another game, I will know the difference. And that's exactly what God wanted to hear out of your mouth, Daniel. They all heard Damien say as he and Solangi came down the steps to join them. But that was such a hard lesson for my son, Damien, Milou said. Yes, it was, Milou. But now, I'm sure if Daniel ever wanted to enlist, he will do it in full knowledge of what may be the consequences of his decision.